It is good to be here, Michael. Thank you so much for that introduction. This is part two of a series that we're doing here in this program on basically the 10 steps for helping prevent and even reverse aspects of Alzheimer's. So I'm looking forward to jumping into it.
All right, floor is yours.
All right, here I'm going to go ahead and share screen and go to advanced share. Okay, can you see that all right?
Yep.
All right, so basically this is part two of 10 steps in testing for and reversing the underlying causes of Alzheimer's. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize it, but there are many tests available today that can give us clues as to whether we are at higher risk for any form of dementia, in particular Alzheimer's disease. And I've been taking advantage of all these tests myself. I have a strong family history of Alzheimer's, and I was shocked as a leading lifestyle medicine doctor to learn that even though I had what I thought was a really good diet and exercise program, etc., I had all kinds of risk factors that go beyond the typical things we normally talk about. So even though I have, I'm very interested in nutritional medicine. I have a master's degree in nutritional medicine. I got interested in nutritional medicine because my mother died of cancer when I was 10 years old. And that made a huge impact on me. So I was always, ever since I was 10, I was thinking, what is it that causes disease? What are the things that I can change now so that I don't end up like mom? Okay. And then now in my professional life, how can I better assist my patients in figuring out what to do? And so it's natural for us, especially those of us that are philosophically or culturally or are emotionally motivated by nutritional principles, to think that, if we're in a really good nutrition program, we're good. Well, a good nutrition program is essential. There's no question. It's critical to good health, but it is not the only factor that determines health. Okay, a quick example here. If you're eating this big green salad every day, let's say you go to this organic place and every lunch you're eating this big old green salad, that's good. In fact, I do that on a regular basis myself. Okay, but what if that green salad was tainted with arsenic? It would still be organic, okay, but it would have arsenic in it, and now you would have serious health consequences because of the toxins you were exposed to. So while nutrition actually helps mitigate some of that, high fiber diets, etc., help the immune system and help with detoxification, we still got to deal with the toxins. So that's why we have to have a much broader approach to understanding reversal of disease and fully preventing future disease as well. So let's go right into this. A quick review. One of the main themes of part one is where we're talking about the lifetime burden, the lifetime risk of developing dementia. And real quickly, I basically established here that the studies started in the mid-70s showed that men had a lifetime risk of 14% of developing dementia. Women had a 23% lifetime risk. But the studies that started 10 years later in the mid-80s actually showed a doubling of the lifetime risk for men from 14% to 35%, and a more than doubling for women as well from 23% to 48%. So much so that those studies that started over 40 years ago actually were showing if you're dementia-free by age 75, there's still a 50% chance that you will end up with Alzheimer's later on in life. Okay, now that was based on studies started 40 years ago, and I just want to suggest that it's much higher than that now. I know because I deal with this every day with multiple patients And the bottom line here is that my sense is as the new studies come out, the new studies are not going to be available for a couple decades. And so, but I believe that if you're my age, I'm 65 this year, if you're above 55 years of age, there's going to be more than a 75% chance of you developing dementia in your lifetime unless you understand the principles we're talking about in this conference. So that's the quick review of where we were last time in part one. Now, I also went over this study that was published by Dr. Dale Bredesen and colleagues in the journal Biomedicine in August of 2024, and basically it was entitled "Sustained Cognitive Improvements in Alzheimer's Disease." In other words, people with Alzheimer's disease were getting sustained improvements in cognition. In other words, they were getting reversal. That doesn't mean that they had a complete reversal. That means that they're improving, and that's the bottom line in this. But that only occurred when they followed a precision medicine protocol. And so that's really what we're going to be initiating in our discussion today. What are the steps? What are the steps in providing precision? We're going to be looking at genetics. How do your individual genetics impact your future risk of developing dementia? So, and bottom line was Dr. Bredesen's clinical study, double-blinded randomized study, basically showed that, let me rephrase that, it was a randomized study because you can't double-blind a study where you're changing people's lifestyle, where you're doing this and that and the other, okay? But it's the best type of study that can be done in this area. So they showed that, yeah, about 12% of the people got a little worse. 4% didn't change at all, but 84% got an improvement. Okay, so we can definitely put time and effort into a program where 84% of the time you're seeing sustained improvements over time. All right, so let's jump right into a quick review of the 10 points. Now, when I work with patients, whether it's in office or by Zoom like we are right now, I am trying to encourage them and give them hope and to give them a sense. And I tell them this, it says, it's not about the limited amount of things that we can do. Some people say, well, this seems so overwhelming. There's so many things to consider, so many tests. Can't we just do a few blood tests and you give me a couple recommendations and then we'll be good? And so I tell them this, I say, the more risk factors we discover for you personally, the better the chances of you improving and overcoming your condition. In other words, if we only find a couple risk factors because we didn't look deep enough, and we treat those, even if we treated those effectively, we're much less likely to make an impact on your goals, where you're wanting to improve your memory, you're wanting to improve your ability to concentrate, your ability to communicate, and your ability to quickly remember names and words and so forth. And so if those are your goals, you want to be finding every area that is somehow contributing to that dysfunction. And so that requires broad testing. So the more we discover, the greater the potential for you to improve. Okay, so that's why I'm all in. I'm all the tests that we're talking about today, and literally dozens and dozens of other tests that we don't have time to talk about today, I've done on myself. Why? Because I have a very significant risk for Alzheimer's. I know, and with my family history and so forth. So let's jump through these real quickly. Number one is that we need to understand cause and effect. And cause and effect here is by testing broadly, as I suggested, risk factors, and then optimizing them, not just normalizing them. In other words, if you have diabetes, just reversing the diabetes and having pre-diabetes, which is a huge step in improvement on your health, is actually not adequate because even pre-diabetes and pre-diabetes scenarios increased risk for dementia dramatically, as well as heart disease, as well as cancer. So we want to optimize those risk factors. Here's the good news. Nearly everybody can. And so it's not appropriate for us to use the excuse like, well, I'm doing so much better than I was. Okay. But we don't want to just do better. We want to be optimal, because many times it requires optimization to get the results we need for brain function to be optimal as well. Okay. So cause effect is critical. And it's important to understand within this context that there are many, many causes. So put aside this notion that even many physicians, have this notion that diseases are caused by one thing. It's called Koch's postulate. And so Dr. Koch, in some cases, certain diseases are caused by one thing, but not in complex scenarios, not in Alzheimer's, not in diabetes, not in the majority of chronic disease. It's rarely caused by one thing. The idea that heart disease is caused by high cholesterol is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Cholesterol doesn't even make the top 10 list in terms of what actually causes heart disease. It may be a player in some cases, but for somebody to think, hey, I'm taking care of my risk for heart disease because I'm on a statin is foolhardy. The research never has shown that, okay, and that's not addressing the potential side effects of that. So we need to look at all the risk factors, and when we are dealing with dementia and Alzheimer's in particular, which represents about 80% of all dementia cases, we are looking at a minimum of 36 risk factors that need to be addressed. Okay, and I would say it goes way above 36. I'm looking at over 100 different risk factors when I'm evaluating a patient, and what we're trying to do is focus on the most important ones that need to be addressed right away. And as we are addressing them, then we look at the potentially lesser important priorities. Okay, now so that's step one. Number two is take advantage of readily available educational resources. I actually addressed that significantly in part one, so I'm just going to briefly review that today. Number three, personalized medicine via genetic testing. We'll get into that. Number four, testing and optimizing vitamin D. I have a whole important section on that. This is really critical because this is also relates to the importance of optimizing our immune system. And vitamin D is one of the most important antimicrobial peptides in the body. Think of it as ammunition that your immune system uses to kill things that are causing you harm or to address issues that are causing you harm. So we'll get into that in detail. There's a huge disinformation campaign vilifying vitamin D, saying, oh, you're going to get too much of that. You could die of this or that if you take too much vitamin D. And they're trying to scare people not to take vitamin D. Don't fall for that trap. Most of us have fallen for way too many traps in the last few years, and we're getting wiser now. We're starting to pay attention to what the actual experts are saying rather than what some medical societies are saying. We'll get into that in more detail. Just over the last couple of weeks, I've been dialoguing with Dr. William Grant, who's the director of the Sunlight Nutrition and Health Research Center in San Francisco. He's actually published over 300 studies on vitamin D and health. And I've actually talked to him about 10 years ago at a medical conference. But he's been doing some really interesting work on vitamin D and publishing. Even this year, he's published some new studies, which I'll review in a minute. And if you ever have a chance to look up just Google Dr. William Grant, San Francisco, and you'll see his website. You'll see all the research he's been doing on vitamin D. Critical for the immune system. We are now in a new era of immune dysfunction that is unparalleled historically. We are now in a situation where the average person in our country and around the world has an impaired immune system compared to what it was several years ago. And so we have to really up the ante about how do we optimize the immune system, which of course begins with all the foundational principles that the people that are learning in this conference online. Okay, so we'll talk more about that. So then, do 3 types of exercise. We'll get into that. Test and optimize omega-3 fats. LabCorp, as of April 25, is no longer going to do that test. I'm shocked. And probably Quest will keep doing it. I'm hopeful. Okay, or some specialty labs will keep doing it. But if you mainly do labs through LabCorp, get your omega-3 omega check blood test before April 25. Otherwise, you have to use a different lab. Optimize your diet. There are foods that heal and there are foods that kill. No question. Okay, so you have to make decisions about what you eat. You can't just moderate everything. You got to avoid things that actually are harmful to your body and optimize the foods that are beneficial and healing. So we'll look at that. Be wise about alcohol, and then of course optimize your immune system. Okay, let's jump right into step 1. So the understanding cause and effect, it's critical to recognize that the single most common underlying driver of dementia, especially of Alzheimer's, is insulin resistance. Now, that term is a little bit hard to understand by the common individual. But essentially, if your muscle cells are not responding to insulin, that means your pancreas got to make more insulin to get the same effect. So that is one way of understanding insulin resistance. If your diet is not optimal and you're eating unhealthy fats and unhealthy proteins and unhealthy carbohydrates, then you're more likely to become resistant to insulin. So now your pancreas just has to make a lot more insulin to try to control your blood sugars, but most of the time it's not able to fully control the blood sugars. And that's why we want to do testing for insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, prediabetes or diabetes. So we'll look at that here more specific. Here's the test that I have been recommending to almost all of my patients, regardless of whether they come to see me, actually, since 1990. And it's called a 4-hour glucose tolerance test. Another challenge that's occurring in healthcare is that LabCorp, which is one of the 2 biggest national labs, has just in the last few months refused to do a 4-hour glucose tolerance test. They'll do a 3-hour. They'll do what's called a 3-hour glucose insulin response test that measures glucose and insulin at each time point, but only up to the 3rd hour. Now, why would I want a 4th hour? The reason a 4th hour is valuable in many cases is because it picks up a precipitous drop in blood sugar that occurs in people that either have a significant hyperinsulinemia. In other words, they're producing so much extra insulin to try to overcome the resistance to insulin in the muscles and in the organ systems of the body, that huge extra load of insulin may not be able to fully control the blood sugars at 1 hour or even 2 hours, but by the 3rd or the 4th hour is overwhelming that and is causing a reactive drop in blood sugar that is dramatic, and it is really bad for your health, and it's really bad for your brain. In fact, I would say that a low blood sugar is far worse for your brain than a high blood sugar. Unfortunately, low blood sugars typically come because of an initial high blood sugar where your pancreas makes extra insulin, drives that sugar back down, and then it overcompensates to cause a low blood sugar. So that is why I strongly recommend a 4-hour blood sugar. Now, that's why I'm switching many of my recommendations, telling them to go to Quest to get those labs, because Quest will still do a 4-hour test. Now, it's possible that, you know, with the advantage of having your own glucose monitor, okay, or having, better yet, a continuous glucose monitor that's in your upper arm, you can be checking your own blood sugars during a test like this, and you can test your own fourth and fifth hour if you wish, and that is very helpful. So at any rate, because I oftentimes measure cortisol levels with these tests, where I measure cortisol at fasting, which is your AM cortisol, with the cortisol at the third hour and the fourth hour, just trying to pick up any fluctuation in adrenal production of cortisol related to a reactive hypoglycemia. So, in other words, your blood sugar should never drop low. They should never drop below 60 or 50, because your adrenals should be able to release a little bit of more cortisol, and that cortisol is the only hormone that generally speaking unlocks the keys or the door for sugar to be released, glucose to be released from the liver. So your liver has like 3 to 4 pounds of sugar in it, but it can't release it unless your adrenal glands produce a little bit of cortisol, and the cortisol then causes the blood sugar to go back up gradually, or sometimes even rapidly if you're under stress. Okay, so those are the tests that give us the greatest insight as to where you are right now individually, how insulin resistant you are, how much insulin you're producing after that sugar load or carbohydrate meal, if you prefer, in the right after the initial blood test. And then we're measuring the cortisol, the blood sugar, and the insulin all 4 hours. Okay, so this test, the glucose tolerance test with the insulin at fasting 1 and 2 hours, maybe at 3 and 4 hours if you want it as well, okay, is the best way to assess how bad your metabolic syndrome is, how bad your insulin resistance is. You may not even be pre-diabetic yet based on all the tests, okay, but you may have a significant insulin resistance, which is the main driver of dementia. It's the main driver of heart disease as well. Many studies have shown that insulin resistance is actually one of the main drivers, if not the main driver, of heart disease, of plaque buildup in the arteries of the body. And that's far, far, far more important than cholesterol. Again, no question about that. So now it can be related to high triglycerides, a low HDL, and so forth. So that's why I encourage this. I had a patient yesterday who has heart disease, even though he's on a perfect diet. And I reviewed the diet with him. He's on a really good plant-based diet, but he has heart disease. He has coronary artery disease, plaque buildup in his arteries. He's already had 3 stents, and he has a family history of Alzheimer's. But he wasn't yet concerned about Alzheimer's. But what he doesn't realize is that's where this is headed. Okay, so even though he'd had no family history of diabetes, we are running this test, and he'll get that test done this next week, and then we'll go over it. And then the hemoglobin A1C, which is commonly considered just to be your average blood sugars over the last 3 to 4 months, but it's actually a pathology test. I mean, it is an average as well, but it's an average because of the pathology caused by spiking blood sugar. So you may have a perfect fasting blood sugar, a perfect 2-hour blood sugar, so you don't meet any of the official diagnostic criteria for diabetes or prediabetes, but your 1-hour blood sugar may be above 150, or it may even be above 200, okay? And yet you don't meet any of the criteria officially for diagnosis. You have significant insulin resistance in that case, and your A1C is going to start going up. Why? Because of that initial spike in your blood sugar causes an irreversible change or glycosylation or caramelization of all proteins in your body, including the hemoglobin molecule in your red blood cells. So So definitely check the hemoglobin A1C, but that is the least sensitive of all the tests. It's a great test. I do it in every patient. Okay, but the most sensitive test is the 1 hour insulin and the 1 hour glucose after that 75-gram glucola, which is comparable to a medium Sprite, which is also comparable to eating a cup and a half of white rice, okay, or some mashed potatoes. So some people say, oh, I would never drink, that much sugar. And so if my blood sugar is high after that, that's only because, something that I never do. And I said, well, would you ever eat a couple cups of rice? And oh, sure. Okay, well, it's not the same thing because obviously rice has other nutrients in it. Okay, but the excess carbohydrate that you are not able to metabolize properly because of insulin resistance is going to cause a spike in your blood sugars, and that is really bad for the brain. So anyways, that's step one. Get that done. That's really critical you do. By the way, most doctors don't think that a glucose tolerance test is indicated or necessary. I disagree 100%. Again, I've been ordering this now for 35 years for most of my patients, and I have found that it's one of the most insightful tests. Why? Because I have so many patients that I'm treating for dementia or heart disease or who have cancer and wanting to optimize their immune system. Okay. And we, by the way, high insulin levels drive cancer aggressively. So you got to control insulin if you want to have any hope to prevent further progression of your cancer or to help with the other strategies actually fight that cancer effectively. Okay, so bottom line is that the insulin levels are critical to understand. So we'll talk more about that as we go. So now I actually have a giveaway here on my website. If you just go to dryoungberg.com, that's my website. You can just Google my name here if you can't find it. Okay, and then go to the services tab and drop down to the labs tab. Okay, when you do that, you will be able to download 2 things free of charge. You don't even have to put your email in there to do it. You will be able to download this 11-page document that actually explains a 2-hour glucose tolerance test, the first 2 hours of the glucose tolerance test. I initially put this together for a workshop I did in Dubai last year, and so they only had a 2-hour test available, so that's why I did too. But the bottom line is it explains everything about insulin to glucose ratios and how to determine whether or not you have early insulin resistance or very advanced insulin resistance. It also helps you understand whether you have mild pancreatic failure versus severe pancreatic failure, where you already lost over 90% of your insulin producing capacity, even though you're not a type 1 diabetic yet. Okay, so this is a very important handout. And then it gives you 20 strategies, all natural strategies that you want to consider in actually helping reverse your prediabetes or diabetes or insulin resistance. Now, I actually am now recommending most of my patients who have a tendency to spiking in their blood sugars, even if it's only at 1 hour after the beginning of a meal, to get a continuous glucose monitor. You can go online and order a Stelo from Dexcom, a Stelo continuous glucose monitor without a prescription. And it sticks to your arm for 14 days straight, and you basically have a continuous readout of what your blood sugars are night and day. Okay, so you use that to see what are the things that are impacting your blood sugar. I really believe this is the most effective initial strategy to improve your health. Okay, because over 75% of adults have some type of insulin resistance or in pre-diabetic scenario. Okay, so that you can download this document. You can also download 32 pages of my book, Memory Makeover: How to Prevent Alzheimer's and Reverse Cognitive Decline the Natural Way. It has chapters 1 and 2 in it, and it has the chapter on labs, which we're going to be going over next. Pages 83 and 84 of that chapter, which is included in the free download, goes over all the labs that I recommend. And the labs are also listed on my website in this same section under services and labs. So check that out. Check that out. Now, I first started learning about this in 1985. I was actually in my professional training at Loma Linda University at the time. And one of my professors brought out Dr. James Anderson, who is the chief endocrinologist at the University of Kentucky at Lexington. And he'd published multiple studies in the 70s on reversing diabetes. Yes, in the 70s. And I was aghast. I was shocked that here is a student studying lifestyle medicine and clinical preventive care that I had never heard of this. So I talked to him, developed a friendship with him, and I committed my career to helping people reverse insulin resistance. So this has been known for more than 50 years in the medical literature, and it's still not being adequately addressed. Okay, so then 10 years ago, I came across this study by Dr. Dale Bredesen. Actually, a colleague of mine turned me on to this. In fact, a colleague from Australia said, hey, you got to check this out. So I looked into it, and sure enough, Dr. Bredesen had published a study in the journal Aging. Basically, it was 10 case studies of individuals that he'd worked with that were able to reverse their cognitive decline. Subsequently, I ended up treating one of the patients who was an executive, and he just needed some additional support. But basically, as I read over this study, I was intrigued by the fact that Dr. Bredesen pointed out that one of the main underlying drivers of type 2 diabetes, excuse me, of Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment is insulin resistance. Again, when your blood sugars start going out of whack, when your triglycerides start getting high, your HDL cholesterol starts dropping, your blood pressure might start going up a little bit, but not necessarily super high. Your waist to hip ratio is out of balance. You're gaining abdominal weight. Your fasting blood sugars are starting to get a little high, potentially maybe as high as above 100. All those are indicators of insulin resistance. But the very best test for it, once again, is the 4-hour glucose tolerance test. So I realized, I said, wow, I can actually be helping patients who have a family history of Alzheimer's or who are now starting to have problems with cognition. And prior to 10 years ago, I had worked with people with Alzheimer's, but only because they came to me for other reasons. And so I actually started incorporating my practice in that way. And now I'm spending literally 80% of my clinical time helping people who either have a family history of Alzheimer's, which means they have a much higher risk, or they have the ApoE4 genetic mutation, which means that their relative risk is at least 500% higher, or if they have a double copy mutation to the ApoE4, that's a 1,200% increased relative risk compared to those without the mutation. So all of this is mitigatable. In other words, just because you have a family history like I do, or just because you have a genetic mutation, and I have many of them, doesn't mean that you're stuck, that you know now it's genetic and woe is me. No, it just means that we need to work a little harder to address the actual underlying causes. Okay, so that's what, and so I ended up studying with Dr. Bredesen and became good friends with him and started working with him. And he's one of the most gracious neurologists I have ever met. I mean, he is always giving me advice free. He'll write up a whole long email that would probably take him 30 minutes to write up just to help me with a patient who's struggling in a given area. Now, and then Dr. Bredesen pointed out to me the work of Dr. Suzanne de Lamont, who's a neuropathologist at Brown University. And, and so Dr. Suzanne de Lamont basically was the first to show back in the 90s that Alzheimer's was largely due to insulin resistance of the brain. And she coined the term type 3 diabetes. That's her doing. And so basically, Alzheimer's disease is very similar to diabetes, it's just in the brain. And you could say the same thing about diabetes, that type 2 diabetes is actually Alzheimer's of the pancreas. It's a very similar pathology. And that's another reason why, if you have type 2 diabetes, we want to reverse it. Okay, now, I don't say that flippantly. You know, I've specialized in reversing diabetes for over 30 years. And where there's a will, there's a way. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's possible in the majority of cases, but it takes work. We need to figure out, it's not just diet, not just exercise. We got to dig into the toxins issue. We got to dig into mold exposure issues. We need to look at all the factors that are contributing, and we'll see that in a second as we look at labs. So if you're interested in this research, Dr. Suzanne de Lamont has published many, dozens and dozens of studies on this very topic. So in 2018, I had the privilege to work with Dr. Bredesen. Collectively, there was about 14 of us health professionals that provided documentation on the reversal of cognitive decline in 100 patients. And this was published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease and Parkinsonism. So that's in 2018. Now, and then same year, I actually published in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine, and the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which I helped found back over 20 years ago. So basically, you can look up these studies and these reports, these reviews, if it seems that what I'm saying is a little bit too hopeful. Okay. All right. So let's just jump right into it. So in order to get effective improvements in Alzheimer's, we must first address the underlying causes of the disease and focus on combination strategies. Don't say, well, I'm going to try exercising for a couple months, see if that helps. Exercise always helps, but it's not enough. You got to do more than just exercise. You don't just say, well, I'm going to stop doing that and I'm going to really work on my diet and see if that makes a difference. So the most research is monotherapeutic, which means it's not going to work ultimately. It's not going to work nearly as well as a multi-therapeutic protocol that addresses many combination strategies. So it needs to be a comprehensive, network-based, synergistic approach. It will be necessary to target multiple pathways at the same time in order to affect an improvement in symptoms and pathophysiology. In other words, by doing testing, baseline testing, we want to be able to show and prove essentially that we've had an impact on that specific pathology, that specific pathophysiology, which is what blood tests and urine tests and stool tests are all about. Is they're picking up pathophysiology, and then we come up with strategies on how to reverse that. Okay, so the goal is not simply to normalize metabolic parameters, but rather to optimize them. So for an A1C, as long as you're not on a medication for diabetes or pre-diabetes, okay, the A1C should be 5.1, 5.2, or even a little lower. Okay, so the idea that anything up to 5.7, which is the beginning of pre-diabetes, is okay, is actually a very, very bad idea, because it actually is showing pathology already. Even a hemoglobin A1C of 5.3, 5.4 shows extra pathology for cardiovascular disease. So we don't want to allow that normal level. We want to optimize the level specifically. Okay, I'm gonna blow through these real quick here. So if you want to take pictures of the screen, do so. But better yet, just go to the free download that I mentioned earlier on my book. It has all this information in it. and my website has all the information in it. So bottom line is when we're talking comprehensive lab testing, we're talking about 20 times more than you normally do for a physical. I mean, it's at least 20 times more, a lot more. And that's why, if you're a relatively healthy individual, you're not going to be able to justify getting all these labs done through your insurance. And so my advice to you is stop thinking that if you can't get your insurance to pay for it, you're not going to do it. Because you're basically hurting yourself by not doing it. There are ways to get highly discounted labs on any lab you want. In fact, you can go to altalabtests.com, which we'll see in a minute, and you can, on your own, order any blood test you want through Quest. Anything that Quest makes available, and they're one of the 2 top national labs, you can order yourself. So don't say that you have to rely on any of your doctors to order the test. I tell patients, listen, I'm willing to help you order all these, okay, but you can actually do it yourself, okay? And obviously you want to work with somebody that knows what that means, right? You can always do your own research, but let yourself be guided by somebody that understands the process. So basically, you want to be checking inflammatory patterns, CRP, the high sensitivity, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor, homocysteine, B6, B12, folate, vitamin D, omega-3, the comprehensive metabolic profiles, the high advanced lipoprofiles, the LDL particle number, the small LDL particle number, the lipoprotein A, the lipoprotein phospholipase A2, which is literally measuring enzymes that leak out of plaque-infested tissue. So those are very important tests. Again, we talked about the glucose tolerance test already. The trophic factors, which they basically are hormones to help the brain heal and help the brain basically with neurogenesis, the development of new neurons, the development of new synapses that have to be made every night before the next day, or else you're not going to remember anything you did that next day. Okay, so you got to be making synapses every day, basically 24/7, mainly at night, or else you're not going to remember stuff. Okay, so if you have a short-term memory problem, then you need trophic factors, which include, by the way, vitamin D, but especially thyroid. So a full thyroid profile. Estradiol, estrogen is critical to memory for women. Testosterone is critical to memory for men, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to make sure that we're looking at various minerals, calcium, copper, magnesium, selenium, zinc, etc. Looking at toxins like mercury, lead, aluminum, etc. Looking at mold susceptibility. Do you have mold in your house? Do you have a physiologic genetic mold and epigenetic mold susceptibility as measured by the HLA-DRDQ test? Do you have mold in your urine test, meaning that you have a lot of mold toxins in your body organ systems, etc. So all those kind of tests, that's just part of the test that we recommend. So just as in other chronic diseases, the goal is to reach a threshold effect. The more things we fix, the closer and closer you get to that tipping point where all of a sudden you're getting better really quickly. Okay, but it may take a while to improve so many things that are required to eventually get you to that threshold effect, that tipping point, such that once enough of the underlying causal network components have been impacted, the pathological process would be halted or even improved. So the approach is personalized based on over 100 different data points, including labs, scans, cognitive tests, and history. The protocol is continued optimization over time. Each network risk factor is addressed in the most rational, physiologic way and as far upstream as possible. Okay, so I went over this summary of the process because a lot of people still believe in the mantra, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. There's really not much that we can do. I had a patient just yesterday, a first-time patient from Virginia, and and she had just been to the neurologist for 3 consecutive visits, and the neurologist had did some basic short neuropsychological testing on her, and says, well, you're technically in a mild cognitive impairment category right now, but based on your answers to my questions, there's a 95% chance that you have Alzheimer's in your future. And so I'm a believer in telling people the truth, what the risks are. Okay, but to say that without giving them hope that they can reverse that risk, I think is unconscionable. Okay, because a lot of people would have just given up, but she didn't. She said, "Oh no, okay, I saw a video with Dr. Youngberg, and I'm going to go see him, and we're going to figure this out, right?" So she already had some hope that this was doable, but a lot of people, they just trust what they're told, and so now hope is destroyed. And they don't even want to go back to their neurologist now because their neurologist already told them that, well, even the drugs we have available don't really even slow down the process that much. They make you feel a little bit better for a while, but they don't change the pathology, the progression of pathology. So so the bottom line is the protocol has continued optimization over time, each network risk factor being addressed in the most rational way. So that's what we're trying to do here. This is all evidence-based. This is not somebody's idea of what might work. This is based on medical research that we're bringing together and doing it all at the same time as naturally as possible. Okay, so let's come up with a functional definition of dementia here. Okay, which is a decline in mental ability severe enough to interfere with activities of daily living. So you can have cognitive decline at multiple stages prior to being diagnosed or meeting the criteria for dementia. Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, or Lewy body disease, or frontal temporal dementia, the different kinds of dementia. So do you want to wait till you actually have an official diagnosis before you start doing something about it? Or would it make sense to start addressing the underlying cause of the pathology as early as possible? Okay, again, it's a question of understanding the cause and having a sense of hope that it can actually be accomplished. Okay, so you can actually, if you have word finding issues, I had a patient who was a very respected architect, and he was brilliant. He had a very good business as an architect, and he was very sharp in all the things that involved his architectural work. Okay, but in a conversation, the first time I met with him, during that hour consultation, there was 10 times that I noticed that he was word fishing. So clearly a highly intelligent individual. And but he was frequently, every 5 or 10 minutes, he was saying, and I knew what word he was thinking of because he was kind of going around that word. And so I eventually I was able to say, you mean the pen? Yeah. So it was just some simple word that did not take any significant intelligence to figure out. He was able to talk about very complex issues with me, but he just forgotten the name of the pen, okay, or the pencil. And so he was very open with me about his concern. Like, I'm having a conversation with a fellow architect and maybe some engineers, and we're talking about stuff, and I can't think of a stupid little word that even a kindergartner would be able to remember instantly. I just can't think of it. I can think of everything around it. I can think of 20 synonyms. I just can't think of that word. Okay, so that's a sign that you're basically blowing up you're blowing up synapses. You're under the influence of something that's damaging that. And I'll talk more about that specific case a little bit later. So you can have all that, but it's actually not majorly interfering with your activities of daily living. Yes, it's embarrassing, that you can't think of that word, but you're still able to accomplish the goal of that conversation. You're still able to do your work, your job. You're still able to drive and get dressed and do all the things that normal people do. It's just that you're not as sharp as you used to be. Okay, so that's very important. Now, here's the second step. Take advantage of the readily available resources. We already addressed this in part one, so I'm just going to blow through this really quick. If you haven't seen this documentary by Hideyuki Tokigawa, a very gifted Japanese documentarian, called Memories for Life, Reversing Alzheimer's. Brilliant. It actually raises the issues that any family or couple would have if they're starting to struggle with that. What is worth doing? So it's a very unbiased, critical approach looking at these issues. Another resource is, as Michael mentioned at the beginning during the introduction, I used to do a week-long program for families, for couples, that would come into Coronado Island at the Marriott Resort. We'd spend a week together going over 15 hours of intervention. And of course, during COVID, we stopped doing that. I had that professionally videotaped. That's available as a membership program on my website, dryoungberg.com. Reignite Recognition, Restoring Optimal Memory. The book, of course, we've talked about. You can get that free download of the first two chapters and the lab chapter on my website. It's a free download. Okay, and then if I mentioned earlier about the rise of immune deficiency and how that is causing more diabetes, dementia, blood clots, and autoimmunity in this whole pandemic era. Okay, we have now a huge burden of immune dysfunction. And if you're interested in that, I have a whole 7-part series on Rumble. Just Google my name and you'll see it. All right, and then the Diabetes Undone series, which is a comprehensive lifestyle medicine approach to reversing insulin resistance, prediabetes, and diabetes. And this is a program that is part of the curriculum for preventive medicine residents as well as family medicine residents. So here's step 3, genetic testing. Now, recently there's been a lot of discussion about genetic testing and whether people should do it, whether it's safe, whether it's private. Well, let's be real. There's nothing ultimately private anymore because of the internet, right? So anything that's on the internet or that is on a website is not private, at least not in the strictest sense, because of hackers, right? So at least we should know what our genetic information is, even if somebody else could access it later on. Okay, the reality is if you've ever done a blood test, they got your genetic information if they want it. Okay, so at least we should know, and we call this precision medicine or personalized medicine. So let's look into this. It was Plato who said, "Know thyself." And so one of the ways that we know ourselves is by looking at our genetic mutations that we carry. A lot of people think, I don't want to know about my mutations because they have this belief that genetics means there's nothing you can do about it. Well, that's actually not true at all. Okay, it's what we were raised to believe. It's what I was even taught to believe in 40 years ago when I was in my professional training. But really, it's not true, because a genetic mutation, while we cannot change that per se without using CRISPR technology, which is getting into dangerous territory because we don't really understand all the ramifications of that. But generally speaking, you can't change the fact that you have a genetic mutation, but you can change the outcome of that genetic mutation. And that's ultimately all that's really necessary, all that really matters. Okay, so for instance, when I did the genetic testing with 23andMe, I knew the risks of media, of breaches of security. I knew all those risks. And yes, they got hacked, last year. Okay. But that doesn't change the value of the test for me. When I did the test, I discovered things about myself. I had no idea that I had these risk factors. I found out that I was factor V Leiden mutant. I found out that I had a major blood clotting risk factor that increased my risk of having a blood clot in my heart, in my brain, in my lungs, anywhere in my body by 800%. Now, is that something you want to know, or is that too stressful to know about? Of course you want to know that. Why? So you could initiate a strategy to undo that risk. So when I found out about that risk factor, I knew enough about genetics to, rather than go like, why is me, rather than say, play the victim, like, oh my God, I have this horrible mutation and eventually I'm going to die of a massive heart attack or stroke and there's nothing I can do about it because it's genetic. No, I immediately celebrated because now I knew one more thing that I could focus on, and I could be a master of it rather than be a victim of it. Okay, so I'm not at all concerned about having a blood clot because I have a strategy that I follow. I know I'm at higher risk, okay, but because I addressed that, I'm actually now at lower risk than the average person. Okay, so we want to know ourselves in the broadest sense on that perspective. So here's the ApoE4 genetic mutation that I crossed out the name following the HIPAA laws here. You see here that this is a yellow highlight, a plus minus. It means that you have one copy of that mutation from one of your parents, but not the other. We don't know which unless we measure the parent directly. But this individual, a patient of mine, because of this single copy mutation to ApoE4, they have a 500, on average, a 500% increased risk of developing Alzheimer's compared to people who don't have that mutation. That's a 5-fold greater risk. Okay, is that important to know? Absolutely important to know. And again, that is mitigatable. In other words, we can neutralize this risk by paying attention to all the factors that drive Alzheimer's. So the gene doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's. The gene just means you're at higher risk. So when you're walking on the edge of a wall, you're at higher risk of falling off that wall unless you take precautions. So you don't have to fall off that wall. You can just take precautions and you're good, right? So that's an important, so there's all kinds of tests. So if you, one of the research studies done some years ago showed that Alzheimer's symptoms begin on average at the age of 84 if you don't have the Alzheimer's mutation. And by the way, there's many genes that relate to Alzheimer's, not just the ApoE4, but that's the main one we talk about. When we do the assessment clinically, we talk about many of the genes. Like for instance, I don't have the ApoE4 gene, but I have the TLMM40 mutation, which is very significant risk for Alzheimer's as well. And that tells me what I can do to impact my risk from that perspective. So if you have one copy of the mutation, your E3, E4, that means you're going to start average symptoms of Alzheimer's 10 years earlier, 9 years earlier. Okay, if you have double copy mutation, that starts at age 68 on average. So in other words, we want to pay more attention. And of course, there's blood tests now called brain scan by neurocode, where you can actually measure what's going on in your brain for amyloid deposition, for inflammation in the brain, and neurodegeneration in the brain. Those tests are available. Okay, so bottom line, we are to be guardians of our genome. Okay, but to be guardians of it, we have to know what's there. You can't protect what you don't know about. Okay, but then we get into epigenetics. So knowing what your genetic mutations are helpful because it tells us what to do to prevent downstream negative effects. Okay, but there's also many factors that affect the way the genes work, independent of the genes themselves. In other words, it's a matter, genes matter, but it's the expression of the genes that matters the most. So this is where we have the opportunity to turn genes on and off. So you may not have any of the Alzheimer's related mutations, okay, but because of your lifestyle or because of environmental exposures, you may be turning on other genes that are damaging you more. You may be activating genes that were otherwise dormant that, if activated, are actually bad for you. They promote disease. Or you may be shutting down healthy genes that otherwise would be protecting you, but now since they're shut down, you're not being protected. So that's what we mean by epigenetics. These are the expression of genes based on what you do. So here's a great way to explain that. I call it the exposome. All the things in our lives, okay, all the exposures, environmental exposures, all the things that we do, of our exercise program, all the things that we eat, all the things that we say, all the things that we think. All those are part of our exposome. So yes, just our thought process. If we have a negative thought process, if we have a hostile perspective, even though we're smiling all the time and saying all the right things, but down deep inside we're resentful and we're hostile. We harbor unforgiveness in our hearts. That causes genes to be expressed in unhealthy ways. It suppresses the healthy genes, it activates the unhealthy genes, and that promotes cancer, that promotes autoimmunity, that promotes all kinds of problems that we need to address. So pay attention. So here's my favorite definition or perspective, if you will, on dementia. This is from me, based on my experience. I believe and refer to dementia as a temporary cognitive impairment associated with acute exposure to one or more dementogens that collectively cross a threshold level, leading to decreased functionality in judgment, communication, organization, and the normal functions of daily living. Now, let me give you one example that will make this very obvious to you. You might be thinking, oh, that can't be true. But what about the inebriated person who's drunk? Okay, that would actually fit this definition. It's a temporary cognitive impairment, with acute exposure to one or more dementogens. Alcohol is a dementogen. Okay, and you'll see in a little bit that even small amounts of alcohol have long-term gradual dementogenic influence on the body. The architect that I was talking about, he got to the point after 6 months of working with me and following all these strategies, fixing and optimizing all these different labs that we do. And he got to the point where in an hour consultation with me, he only was word fishing once compared to 10 times when we first met. So a 90% improvement in cognitive function from that perspective. Well, then he went on vacation with his wife. They rented a bungalow on the beach, and they were like stress-free. It was like a good time. They're reading books, just enjoying being together and relaxing, not having to worry about work or anything going on at home. And he said, a couple days into my vacation, I started having major problems with word finding. And so he came to visit me. He said, man, this really stressed me out because, I was on vacation. I was de-stressing. I was enjoying the sunshine and the relaxation and the rest and the peace of mind. And all of a sudden, I started having word finding problems. And so, my job clinically is to connect the dots and figure out what's responsible, right? Because many times, individually, we might not be able to see that. Well, so I started asking him, well, what did you do differently while at the beach that you normally don't do? And you say, well, I was reading a lot. He says, well, that's not going to cause word finding problems, right? So he started going through the list of stuff and, says, no, we still ate really well. We made smoothies and we ordered from the organic market that was nearby. So he said, no, the diet was still good. And so we started going through the different categories, and all of a sudden he goes like, oh, I know what it was. I go, what was it? And he says, one of the things that we did differently is we thought, hey, I had actually convinced him months before that he was just having one or two beers at night after work, and it wasn't a heavy drinker at all. He was very much a social drinker, or what we would call a moderate drinker, and so I showed him some studies that I'll show you in a little bit that even just a couple drinks a week were associated with hippocampal neural degeneration, the part of the brain responsible for memory. And this was a big study, 30-year study with MRIs published in the British Medical Journal, one of the few medical journals that has some sense of credibility left. Okay, so I mean, serious. Okay, so I'd convinced him that for him, it was probably a good idea to just completely stay away from alcohol for now and evaluate that. Well, so he said, man, I wasn't thinking, I'm on vacation. So we started having a couple beers every day while we're hanging out, on the beach, right? And so, what could be harmful with that, right? Well, that was the factor that made the difference for him. Okay, because once you're at a point where you've lost enough neurons in the hippocampi to start having problems with word finding, you've already lost millions and millions of neurons by that point. Millions, okay, and many millions. And so we don't have the resiliency or the reserve capacity that we used to have. So most people can have a couple beers here and there, and they don't notice anything. Okay, but for somebody who's already starting to notice cognitive decline, they don't have that resiliency. So they have to be much more careful with that. And those of us with the higher family history and the other risk factors and the genetics and so forth, we want to make decisions earlier on, because the pathology of Alzheimer's actually starts 15 or more years prior to the first symptoms. Yes, you heard me right. The pathology, the atrophy of that section of the brain, the damage to that section of the brain begins more than 15 years prior to the first symptoms of cognitive decline. So that's really important to understand. Okay, now, okay, step 4, and I want to really highlight step 4 here because as I mentioned, I just recently had a chance to dialogue with Dr. William Grant from San Francisco, who's basically published many hundreds of studies on vitamin D. And this is a critical area. In fact, I would almost say, if you don't learn anything else from both parts of this section, get this part right, please. Because again, we're in a new era of immune dysfunction. And vitamin D is one of the most important strategies to protect your immune system. It's not the only one, and we should never rely on it alone, okay? But it's just one of those critical factors. It's kind of like not having a sidearm if you're a police officer. You think that's actually a critical thing to have on hand in case it's needed, right? And so that's the same thing with vitamin D, in case it's needed, and I guarantee you it's going to be needed, okay, by all of us. Okay, so here's the bottom line. You want to test for and optimize your vitamin D. In my opinion, above 50 nanograms per milliliter. If you're going by European standards, or they use a different set of units, and you would have to multiply by 2.5 to get the nanomoles per liter. So you want to be above 125. Now, this is way above the standard of care. The standard of care is a bad standard. I just want to make that really clear. The standard of care, which is what most, quote, authorities recommend, is that it just should be above 20. Okay, and yes, it should be above 20, but it should be way above 20. It should be above 50. Okay. And to say that if you're above 20, let's say you're 21, 25, 28, that you're okay, that's just simply not true. Yeah, every little bit counts. Okay, but it's kind of like saying, well, yeah, most people believe that, getting 6 to 8 cups, 8-ounce cups of water a day is a reasonable goal for an average adult, right? I think most people would agree to that. Okay, but the new vitamin D guidelines, actually even the old guidelines, are basically like saying you really only need about half a cup of water a day. And you might be able to live on half a cup of water a day. You just wouldn't live very healthfully. Okay, so be careful who you believe, and I'm really serious about this. It's just one thing I've learned over my 40 years of practice is that we pay attention to what the national societies and agencies say. We pay attention to them, but like Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. And now I say, don't trust, verify first before you trust anything. And so that's likewise in this. All the new guidelines are really weak. The standard of care in medicine is not a very good standard. You want to go way, way beyond the standard of care if you're going to be preventing Alzheimer's, if you're going to be preventing and reversing diabetes, etc. Okay, so I recommend that you test twice a year until you figure out what the right dosing is for you. Everybody's a little different. Okay, in the fall, that's the highest blood vitamin D level based on your sun exposure. Okay, but once again, most of us don't get enough sun exposure or even close to make enough vitamin D. If you're on a statin and you're outside all day long all in the summer, you're making very little vitamin D. Why? Because statins block the production of vitamin D in the body from cholesterol. Well, they block the stage of cholesterol, okay, before it turns into vitamin D. So you're not going to get vitamin D of any consequence, of any clinical consequence. If you're using sunscreen, you're negating the production of vitamin D in your body. And if you're over 50, 60, you're probably not going to generate much vitamin D anyways. We become very inefficient in producing vitamin D when under sun exposure as we age. I'm not saying don't get out in the sun. Yes, you want to be out in the sun. Sunlight has many other benefits, and maybe you'll make some vitamin D too, especially in the late spring and summer months if you're out in the middle of the day. So if you go outside in the day and you look at your shadow, so see where the sun is, look at your shadow, and if your shadow is longer than you are tall, you're essentially not making any amount of vitamin D that's clinically significant. Okay? And so most people are out in the sun before that or after that. And so you're not actually in the sun at a time where you're generating vitamin D. Okay, so there's a lot of societies that have really bad guidelines. I think I've made that clear. Okay, but the American Gerontological Society, at least last I checked, is still saying that you take 4,000 units daily. That's very reasonable, and up to 10,000 units daily. It was Dr. Robert Heaney from Creighton University who had published hundreds of studies on vitamin D. He told me and another doctor when we were talking to him years ago in 2008, he said, how much cancer you want to prevent, how much disease you want to prevent. In other words, optimize the vitamin D. But he also said that every baby, child, and teenager should at minimum be adding 2,000 units of vitamin D to their daily supplemental intake, even if they're outside a lot. Every child, 2,000. Okay, that's minimum. And a big study out of Finland showed years ago, and it was a 30-year study that began in the 60s and ended in the 90s. And Finland has the highest rate of type 1 diabetes, a very serious autoimmune condition. And they were able to decrease the risk of type 1 diabetes autoimmunity by 90% just by taking 2,000 units of vitamin D from birth on, actually during pregnancy as well. Okay, so I worked with gestational diabetics for 7 years at a clinic back in the early 2000s. And there's two main things I did for them. Well, three things. Optimizing their blood sugars, right? So if you're pregnant with and you have diabetes during pregnancy or even pre-diabetes, we want you to keep your fasting blood sugars below 90 and your 1 hour after the beginning of the meal blood sugar of under 120. That's not easy to do. Okay. And that's because how well you control your blood sugars during pregnancy determines 75% of the risk of your baby developing type 2 diabetes later on in life. That's important, right? That's why you got to control your blood sugars during pregnancy. And so we did that, number one. Number two, I gave every pregnant woman 10,000 units of vitamin D. Some of you may think, oh, that's too much. Maybe you caused some problems. Maybe that caused some damage. No, all the studies with pregnant women used 10,000 during that era. Okay, and I would still do that, but I would check to make sure that we're optimizing vitamin D levels and not overdoing it. So some people might not need 10,000. How do we know? We check. And then the third thing was the omega-3s, which we're the EPA DHA that we'll get into in a little bit. So here, in 2014, there was a great study published in the journal Neurology, we're talking about Alzheimer's now, that showed that even mild vitamin D deficiency increased the risk of dementia epidemiologically by 51%. But if you had even more significant vitamin D deficiency, the increase of dementia went up 125%. Big study published in a major medical journal. Well, that same month that this study came out, there was an article, I believe it was in the Archives of Internal Medicine, one of the internal medicine journals, that basically was an opinion article that said we should not be wasting our time measuring people's vitamin D levels, and we should definitely not be supplementing patients with vitamin D. And they came up with all kinds of reasons they thought that was important. So I remember thinking to myself, well, who am I going to believe? This major study that was published in the journal Neurology, okay, my own past experience with this, or some doctor that just has an opinion that nobody should check their vitamin D, and it gives no good scientific research to back it up. Okay, so again, we got to be careful who we believe. Okay, now in the last couple of years, there have been reports of vitamin D intoxication associated with over-the-counter supplements. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, if you saw that published in an article and then it was reported in some news agency or other journal, okay, you didn't know what the researchers on vitamin D know, you would think, oh my goodness, I don't want to take any vitamin D because I don't want to risk being intoxicated or being poisoned by vitamin D. Okay, and so so this is in my opinion, was a great public health disservice. Okay, is to just give the impression that this is a problem. Now, what's interesting is that this is a letter to the editor that pointed out some key points. Let me actually show you what they were. So Dr. Michael Hollick, MD PhD at Boston University, he's one of the big researchers on vitamin D. I've talked with him. I've gone to his lectures at multiple conferences, and so he actually did an assessment on this vitamin D intoxication. Okay, so he basically showed that there was this 42-year-old that had a blood vitamin D level of 487. Now, I assure you, it's impossible to get that by taking even 20,000 units of vitamin D every day. I know because I've tested everybody for the last 25 years. Now, indeed, he was getting too much vitamin D. No question. Obviously, his blood test is definitely in the toxic range, way above 250, which is kind of a general cutoff for toxicity. And then, yes, his serum calcium levels were very high as well, as were his creatinine levels, which suggest damage to the kidneys, at least temporary damage. Now, here was their main issue, is that this guy was taking a vitamin D supplement that was not a major trusted brand. It was literally some private label, basically manufactured in a minimum way, and they basically made a huge mistake in putting this together. Okay, they were saying that there was only 2,000 units of vitamin D in this powder, but what they were actually getting, okay, is anywhere between 1,500 or 1,056, excuse me, 156,000 units of vitamin D, up to over 2.5 million units of vitamin D every day for 2 years. Now, if anything, this case study proves that vitamin D is actually less toxic than water in many respects. In other words, there's all kinds of people. Let me rephrase that. There are many cases that I've studied personally of people dying of water intoxication, drinking too much water without enough mineral and electrolyte support, and they literally die from that. Okay, there has never been, to my knowledge, an account of somebody dying from even taking that much vitamin D. So this person recovered fairly quickly after the doctor discovered, your vitamin D supplement is labeled wrong and produced very, very inaccurately. So, anyways, that's the key of that study. There's many other studies that show. So here's bottom line. Patient was just told to stop overdosing and given an IV for optimal hydration. His blood calcium level resolved before discharge from the hospital. Abnormal kidney labs improved quickly, but it took nearly a year to fully normalize. And vitamin D excess half-life is about 2 months. So it takes time. It's a fat-soluble vitamin. So bottom line is don't overdo it. But here's the problem. Most people, 95% of the public, underdo it, just like they underdo water intake. Okay, so we want to optimize, okay, but how do we know what optimal is? By testing before and testing again 4 to 5 months later to see where you're at. So if this guy had just tested his vitamin D, 3 or 4 months after he started that excessive dose of vitamin D, he would have learned right away that, hey, something's wrong. You got to start, using an appropriate high quality supplement, not something that is just cheap. So lessons learned: buy only high quality brand supplements, right? That should be obvious to all of us. Test vitamin D blood levels in the spring and the fall to make sure you're optimal, not too low, not too high. Almost everybody's too low. Very rarely do I see somebody that's high. Get other complete metabolic profile labs and other appropriate blood tests every 6 to 12 months. And then this is the ultalabtest.com website that you can order your own lab. So some people say, well, my doctor wouldn't order the vitamin D. Guess what? Fewer and fewer doctors are going to be doing that through your insurance. Why? Because the new guidelines do not recommend testing vitamin D. And therefore, your insurance plans now have a rationale to deny vitamin D testing. And if they do so, and if you still convince the doctor to order the vitamin D, that would otherwise have cost you, $50 or $60 to get done, it now will cost, the lab will charge you $350 that I frankly would not pay. I would basically address it with the insurance company. So you should pay for this. Okay, so I would never pay for that lab. Just work it out with your insurance company. Now, the best way is just to do it yourself. Get the 85-90% discount on the lab and do it yourself. That's the best approach. Okay, a couple more studies on vitamin D. During COVID, we knew early on. In fact, I was promoting this in January of 2020. Optimize your vitamin D. Why? Because we have shown with multiple infectious diseases that if your vitamin D is optimized, your ability to sail through that with very few symptoms is very high. Very good. Okay, so here's a great study. Okay, that basically showed that, and I'll just read the title because that explains the results. COVID-19 mortality, that means the risk of dying, correlates inversely, okay, with vitamin D status. In other words, the higher your blood vitamin D levels are, the lower your risk of dying from even the most virulent strain of COVID. Okay, and so it was so significant that they said a death rate close to zero could theoretically be achieved if your vitamin D blood levels were at least 50. So that's one reason I say at least get your vitamin D levels above 50. If you have a chronic disease, I wanted to see it between 70 and 90. Okay, because you need to have a bigger reserve. Why? Because vitamin D gets used up when you're under different types of stressors. Where infections use up your vitamin D. It's like ammo during a gunfight. You use it up. You got to have more with you, or else you're going to run out. Okay, so vitamin D helps kill and get rid of infections much more rapidly. All right, now this is the study that Dr. William Grant just gave me yesterday. In fact, it's a really great study. It's a review paper because it's basically saying what are the optimal recommendations for the general population. And bottom line here is that this was published in the journal Nutrients in January of 2025. So this is very current, and this is a much, much better guideline than what the Endocrine Society came up with in July of 2024. It was a 50-page document that was really bad advice, in my opinion. Okay, so here's I'm going to go read this because this is so important. Thank you, Dr. Grant, for making this available. I know you're online right now as well. So first of all, he says serum concentrations of vitamin D that are greater than 30 nanograms per ml significantly lower disease and mortality risk compared to being under 20. Okay, in other words, don't be satisfied with 25, 26. You want to be at least above 30. Okay, now, so concentration should be at least raised above 30. This is achievable through daily supplementation of 2,000 units daily. That's 50 micrograms each day of vitamin D3, okay, which prevents disease and deaths. Okay, so basically he's echoing what Dr. Robert Heaney from Creighton University has been saying for decades, is that everybody, regardless of how much time they spend outside, should be doing at least 2,000 units. That's the bare minimum, okay? Now, there might be 1 out of 1,000 that don't need that. And how you know you're 1 out of 1,000? Check your vitamin D level, okay? So this is critical for cognition. This is really, why? Because vitamin D protects your brain from infections, which is one of the bigger risk factors right now with the burgeoning problem of cognitive decline. So he goes on to say, furthermore, a daily dose of 4,000 to 6,000 units of D3 would achieve a serum level of vitamin D at between 40 and 70 nanograms per ml. So really, and my real minimum is this range right here. Okay, and what I actually say to most of my patients who actually need more support and greater resiliency than the average population. So if you're otherwise healthy and you don't have any health problems, get it between 40 and 70. Okay, but if you have a chronic condition, I would go 70, 80, up to 90 or so. Okay, you don't need it above 100. If it's above 100, we need to cut back. Okay, so those are the guidelines that I fully support. Okay, so I'm gonna jump through the next steps quickly because I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. But I wanted to highlight those areas first. And so number 5 is you got to strengthen your muscles. And I know there's been a lot of talks on this already, so I'm not going to belabor this. I'm just going to say this real quick. There's 3 main types of exercise that optimize cognitive function. Number 1 is strength training. Now, a lot of people say, wait a minute, strength training, that's just for the jocks, right? That's just for the athletes. No. And I can prove that with the twin studies. If you look at twin studies in middle-aged women, the woman with the strongest thigh muscles, quadriceps, was the woman who had the lower risk of developing dementia. Remember, in a twin study, the genetics are identical. So the only risk is environmental and what you're doing, the choices that you're making. And so if that twin chose to exercise more and therefore had a stronger leg muscles and larger leg muscles, the size and strength of your leg muscles was a major determinant for predisposition to dementia. So that's why everybody, I'm not saying you got to go to the gym and work out for an hour every day. I'm saying work out for 10 minutes every day. Okay, do a little bit, do the 7-minute workout on YouTube, right? That you're doing calisthenics, you're strengthening your muscles. You're doing modified push-ups, modified squats, doing things that activate your muscles, and that directly stimulates your brain. It directly stimulates the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a key hormone that literally heals the brain and helps you produce more neurons and synapses so you can remember things better. Okay, so basically strength training, critical. Either 7 to 10 minutes every day or 20 minutes every other day, like 3 times a week. Then exercising lightly right after meals. Why? Because that blunts the rise of blood sugar, which then blunts the rise of insulin, which then helps control your blood sugars and your hormones, such that you don't have that dementogenic experience associated with metabolism. And then thirdly, the aerobic exercise, where you get your heart rate up, you have a duration of exercise, you're swimming, jogging, doing different types of exercises that basically get your heart pumping and get you into a light sweat, okay, or a good sweat. That is very therapeutic. Okay, so that's okay. Next step is testing and optimizing your omega-3. The omega check is being discontinued on LabCorp. I mean, call in and complain. I don't know. I don't know what they're thinking. And so one of the more important tests, almost everybody is low on EPA and DHA. Almost everybody that I check. And they're certainly not optimal. I've not checked one person who was optimal on EPA, DHA. They might have been close, but they were not optimal yet. So everybody needs to know for themselves that this is really important for them to check. Now, bottom line here is that in the 7-year study published in the journal Nutrients, done by this is the Framingham Health Study. They actually showed that looking at over 1,500 people over age 65, that if their DHA level was less than 3.8 compared to those that had just above 6, the risk of developing Alzheimer's in the next 7 years doubled because of a low level. And my average patient that I check is between 1 and 2. They're between 1 and 2. So that would be more than a doubling of the risk. That would be a quadrupling potentially of the risk. And so this is easy to address by supplementing that appropriately, either with purified fish oil or with the microalgae, which is the vegan omega-3. Just make sure you're using a good brand. I've seen some brands recently that the capsules smell really plasticky. Obviously, you don't want to take something like that, and so you want to make sure you're getting your omega-3 DHA EPA from a clinical grade brand. All right, so that's critical. Number 7, optimize your sleep. There's all kinds of research on this, and let me just show you one real quick. Bottom line is getting to bed earlier is much better. Trying to get your roughly 8 hours of sleep, a minimum of 7 hours, but at least make sure that you're treating sleep apnea and insomnia. And I get it. I'm sure I'm already hearing groans in the audience. I perceive groans in the audience right now. Why? Because this is harder to do than many people realize. But my point is we got to figure it out. Okay, if you don't fix your sleep problem, you're going to have ongoing problems with dementia and other health problems. This is critical to figure out. And the answer is not just throwing more drugs at it. The answer is, in fact, many people have poor sleep because of insulin resistance. It would take me too much time to explain that, but that's why I do anybody who comes to me for insomnia or for problems with sleep, I do the 4-hour glucose tolerance test with insulin, and I frequently discover that they're waking up in the middle of the night because their blood sugars are dropping too low. So we need to stabilize blood sugars and reverse that insulin resistance. So bottom line is that it's estimated that sleep disruption ultimately impacts about 1/3 of our entire genome. So if you're not sleeping well, you are epigenetically damaging the good genes and activating the bad genes. So be mindful of this. And bottom line, Dr. Nerdegaard from University of Rochester published a study showing that the brain actually detoxifies at night during the deep stages of sleep. And so the lymphatic system is a new system that helps detoxify the brain itself. And so if you're not sleeping well, this is not happening. So make sure you work closely with your health professionals to find the answers to optimizing sleep in the most natural way possible. Okay, well, we know that optimizing the diet is critical. Whole foods, plant-based, but cutting out refined carbs is critical. Fast foods and sugars are dementagens. They will, and especially if you already have some level of cognitive decline, you just have something, some sugary foods, it'll put my patients into a transient dementia for up to a week just with one unhealthy meal. Okay, and so, the rest of us may have a resiliency that we can think we can handle unhealthy meals because it doesn't seem to impact our thinking that much, but we're blowing up cells every time we do it. And pretty soon, now our reserve capacity is so small, now we don't have that resiliency anymore. So pay attention. There's been many great presentations this series on this topic, and so I'm going to move on to the next step, and just be wise about alcohol. We could talk an hour on this alone, okay? But let me just say, a couple years ago, I was actually flying up north to Washington State to do a lecture, believe it or not, on Alzheimer's. And I saw this Time magazine special edition in the bookstore of the airport in Seattle, I believe. And so I bought it, and I go, hey, this is the science of Alzheimer's, what it is, how it touches us, and hope. Hope is what really caught my attention. Okay, and then I kind of groaned inwardly when I saw one of the articles was, here's more good news for drinkers. So part of the hope that they were giving was basically telling people that having a couple of drinks every day or every other day was actually potentially lower your risk of dementia, and nothing could be further from the truth. This was basically a paid advertisement. That's what it was, and that's what it is in many journals, by the way. It's just paid advertisement. And so be careful with that. You might remember 10 years ago when Dr. When the main neurologist at Mayo Clinic did a consultation for Glenn Campbell. His wife, his beautiful, loving wife, was with him the whole time through that terrible ordeal. And you can watch the videos on YouTube. You can just Google, you can just search for Glenn Campbell, Alzheimer's, Mayo Clinic, and you'll see. And they clearly mentioned that one of the main reasons Glenn Campbell developed bad Alzheimer's was because of his drinking problem. Now, he wasn't just socially and moderately drinking. He was a heavy drinker. No question that was a big problem. But now let's look at the best study ever done on the topic. The best study ever done was published in June of 2017 by the British Medical Journal. Okay, and they basically found that the higher consumption of alcohol over the 30-year follow-up after a brain MRI was associated with increased odds, or basically the risk of hippocampal atrophy. The hippocampi are the little sections of the brain in each hemisphere that basically help convert short-term memories into long-term memories. Okay, and it was in a dose-dependent fashion. So let's just look at that real quick. And here's the bottom line. If you had more than 1 to 2 drinks a day, your risk of brain atrophy in the memory section, the hippocampal section of the brain, based on MRI imaging, was 580% higher. Okay, but we all kind of know that, that's technically, by the way, more than 1 to 2 drinks a day, okay, is considered heavy drinking. Did you know that? Now, very few people actually think of that as heavy drinking, but medically speaking, that's considered heavy drinking. Moderate drinking is 1 drink a day, up to 1 drink a day for a woman, and up to 2 for a day, for a male. But even that was associated with a 340% increase in hippocampal atrophy. And there was no protective effect of having 1 to 3 drinks per week. Now, you can actually review this study, and the researchers were actually shocked. Believe it or not, they were shocked by the results. So it was a well-done study done over 30 years of time, based on the best brain imaging studies available. And essentially, they documented once and for all that you got to be really careful with alcohol. Now, I know that there's a big movement in the American Medical Association, et cetera, to kind of vilify alcohol, and maybe they're thinking about prohibition again. I'm not for that. If somebody wants to drink, they have a right to drink. Okay, but they should at least know what the risk is. That's my point. That's my point. I said we should have full control, autonomy over our bodies. Nobody else should have a right to tell us what to do, as long as what we're doing isn't putting somebody else at risk. And so bottom line is that this is putting your brain at risk, so you need to make some decisions on that. Okay. And then basically step number 10, here's we're wrapping up. We could talk for hours on this topic alone, but we've already addressed the relationship between vitamin D and optimal immune function. And this is so critical nowadays. Basically, I believe, it used to be that we would, in public health, right? So my expertise is in clinical public health, right? So I am not shy about giving advice to populations of individuals because that's my expertise. And what we used to be taught was that there was modifiable factors and non-modifiable risk factors. We have genetic risk factors, which were termed non-modifiable. Okay, and then we were told about chronic disease. Okay, that is related to lifestyle, etc. And then you have infectious disease. But do you know that actually infectious disease is one of the, if not the most important underlying risk factor for most chronic diseases? Heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, you name it, okay, is actually largely due to infections that are running under the radar or to occasional infections that recur over time that are absorbable. Okay, so bottom line is that we need to do a much better job at helping our immune systems fight infection because we have lost the recent battles on that, and we need to regain control over that. So optimize infections, optimize blood sugars, okay, optimize the immune system in terms of low-grade infections, which by definition are very hard to diagnose. Okay, and so that's why the key is not just having better antibiotics. The key is having a better approach to optimize both the innate and adaptive immune systems so that our immune system fights disease and prevents disease on its own. Our body is designed to heal itself if we have the right nutrients, if we have the right exposures. So that ends, a lot more I could share with you, but that ends the discussion right now of the 10 steps for testing and reversing underlying causes of Alzheimer's.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, doctor, so much. So appreciate all that information. And how would people get in contact with you if they wanted to follow your work?
The best way, Michael, is just to go on my website, which is dryoungberg.com. Or if you're not sure how to spell that, just Google Wes Youngberg and you'll see all my contact information.
And to get your books, how would they go about getting those?
The book, we stopped selling on Amazon a long time ago because they take all the profit. Okay, so we have it available on our website, our store, on our dryoungberg.com. And again, you can download 32 of the pages free to get a sample of what that's about and to get information on the labs and to set the stage for why this is so important. I wrote the book. The book is basically looking at a case study of mine where I had a patient who had Alzheimer's for 15 years already, and her neurologist referred that couple to me kind of as a last-ditch effort. You know, it was like there was nothing else that could be done for this lady, and it is a overview of all the things that we did over a 2-year period and how he got his wife back during that time. It was an amazing regeneration of hippocampal function and his wife because of his love and commitment to helping her do all the things that needed to be done that she and of her own recourse could have never done. So it was because of his willingness to do it that she benefited so much. And there he benefited by having his wife back for many, many more years.
That's amazing. Given that so many people wait until they're sick before they actually go, oh, I need to take care of myself.
Yeah.
How much, so they come very late to the game with regard to the various, things that you've outlined. How much can we, reduce our risk once we're already that far down the path?
Yeah, a great question. And again, that's why I wrote the book, because even I was concerned when I got that referral. I said, man, this is a patient not only had Alzheimer's for 15 years, and I actually met her 6 years before at a diabetes program that I was running. And she had diabetes, but she wasn't really doing much about it. She had early Alzheimer's already at that time, but she wasn't implementing the program. She was stubborn, right? Like many of us are stubborn. We want to do what we want to do. And she didn't really think she could do anything about it. She was not hopeful, but it was ultimately her husband later on that really believed it could be done. And he did it for her, with her. and she got the results. So if somebody at her level of she had less than a first percentile, 1 percentile function in her hippocampus. In other words, the size, the number of neurons in her hippocampi in her brain, the memory neurons, were like less than over 99.9% of the population. So there was just nothing there, very little there. And she was able to dramatically improve her cognition and function over that period of time. So she can do it, all of us can. So but short answer to your question is that we can dramatically improve cognition at any time in that continuum. But you're right, the sooner we pick up on the need for it, the greater will be the impact. And so it's a lot easier to prevent damage to the brain than it is to reverse damage to the brain. That just makes sense. The good news is you can reverse damage especially to the hippocampi. We can actually, the average person is losing 1,000 neurons in their hippocampi every day. Okay, so we can go from losing 1,000 a day to actually gaining 700 or more a day, and that depends on what we're doing and what we're not doing. And that's the whole value of the testing part, is that through testing, we learn where our risk factors are, where we can concentrate to both prevent further damage and to begin to reverse the damage that's already there.
Is she now, would you say, asymptomatic of dementia?
Say that again?
Is this patient now asymptomatic of?
No, this patient actually died of breast cancer 6 years later. And there was reasons for that was not related to what we were doing, obviously. But she made some bad choices at the end that depressed her immune system. And but basically, I called him up after his wife passed away and talked to him for a while. He says, "No," says, "yeah, the good news is that I had my wife back for 6 whole years." In other words, she had been diagnosed with dementia 21 years before, and she, in her mind, 21 years later than she'd had 30 years before. Okay, so she did pass away from a recurrent. She basically had a recurrence of cancer, like a lot of people are having nowadays, again, because of some unfortunate choices that were made.
What are the earliest symptoms that one might have dementia?
So, what's really interesting, I think during phase part 1, I talked about the value of there's tests available where you can actually measure in a blood test. It's called the brain scan by neurocode. You can measure the amount of amyloid plaque in the brain, the amount of inflammation in the brain, and so forth. And that elevation can occur up to 15 years before any symptoms. So there's pre-symptomatic pathology. See, so that we got to remember that symptoms doesn't mean that's the beginning of pathology. Pathology happens way, way before the symptoms, and it's only when you've lost a significant amount of reserve that you start having symptoms. So same thing with diabetes. You've had problems with blood sugars for 20 years, and all of a sudden you get diagnosed with diabetes. You think it's a new event. No, you've been building that up for 20 years, but now you've lost so much beta cell function of your pancreas that now you're diabetic. Okay, so the first symptoms, though, would be things like I described earlier, like word fishing. Okay, and again, it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with a change in what you were used to be able to do. So if somebody had a near photographic memory before and now they don't, well, they may be more like you and I now, but that's a bad sign for them, because that's a sign they're involved in neurodegeneration, even though they still may be more functionally able from an intelligence standpoint than I am. They're clearly on the road to neurodegeneration in a bad way. Other symptoms would be, more advanced symptoms would be where they start, handwriting, writing out checks or calculating. I worked with several executives who, had started multiple companies in Northern California, and they were so good at math that he could just do math in his head no matter what it was, and he lost that ability. And I said, well, I've never been able to do math in my head that easily, but for him, that's a sign of neurodegeneration, and unless he starts addressing that aggressively, it's going to get worse.
And we basically are out of time. I just want to ask you one quick question. There's so much talk now about brain fog. How does one distinguish between dementia and brain fog?
Yeah, I basically, brain fog is a sign that your brain is under attack. Okay, and so brain fog is that temporary, that transient form of dementia. Anytime we're like having a hard time concentrating, that means you're literally damaging the memory neurons in your brain. Your ability to concentrate, your blood sugar might be low, but low blood sugar means you're damaging your brain. So every little thing that causes a symptom of brain fog means that you're damaging the brain little by little by little. So that's why we want to reverse the brain fog right away.
Great. Thank you so much, doctor. That concludes our time. I really appreciate all the information that you shared. Please unmute the audience so they can share their appreciation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, doctor.
Yeah, this is